Shall I start?
No. We'll start one of our student, Disha. She'll begin the webinar. So we are starting right now. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, sir. Disha, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Sure. Let's begin.
Yes, sir. Welcome to everyone. Good evening to one and all. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the relevance of political theory today. My name is Disha Jain and I am more honored than pleased to introduce our principal of KC College, Dr. Hemlata Bagla, who has not only been with us from last 4 years but is also an associate professor of the chemistry department from last 16 years and has also been an educationist and a researcher specializing in nuclear and radiochemistry department from approximately more than 20 years. Also, the most fascinating fact about her is that she is a believer of lifelong learning. How wonderful it is. Also, let me please introduce our today's guest speaker, Mr. Akash Singh Rathore, who is going to talk to us about the relevance of political theory today. This is a subject in which we all should be deeply interested because, as we know, political theory ultimately aims to organize our human life and its scope comprises of a very vast domain. Moreover, unlike other disciplines, political theory is not only confined to the scientific knowledge but also equally concerned with the political philosophy, which concentrates on the determining values, ethics, morals, and the notions of spirituality. Political theory is the philosophical and theoretical underpinning of the political science, which ultimately makes it more realistic, relatable, and usable in our own day to day lives. Over this, our speaker, Mr. Rathore, is an astounding philosopher of an international repute, author of 8 books, including the book of Indian political theory. Not only this, he is an regular contributor to the Indian Express and Outlook magazines with the bylines in the Times of India newspaper. His 20 authored and edited books range from political philosophy, law, and religion to literature, sports, and wine. He has delivered numerous talks, lectures, conferences, workshops, and courses throughout India and abroad. We are really honored to have him today with all of us as a guest speaker. Also, not to forget our Professor Vrutant Sir from our Political Science Department of KC College, who bestowed upon us students with this opportunity to broaden our perspective and to help us learn and know more about the political theory, not only as an academic subject but also as a part of daily life, and without which we all wouldn't have been here. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. So, there will be a small question and answer session at the last. So, please do type your questions as well as your opinions in the chat box. We request our guest speaker, Akash, to please respond to these queries raised by the students about the political theory. Now, without any further ado, let's turn the times over to the Vrutant sir for further progress of the webinar. Thank you. Sir,
you on mute.
Yes.
sir?
Am I audible now? Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much, Disha. Hi, everybody. I'm Vrutant. I'm a faculty of political science at KC College. And on behalf of the Department of Political Science of KC College, I welcome Professor Akash, first of all, for accepting our invitation to give a talk on the relevance of political theory today. Thank you very much, Professor Akash, for joining us. I think that in such a changing and challenging times, this discussion by Professor Akash will prove very enlightening and fruitful for all the students of politics. I'm also optimistic that this webinar will generate hopes and aspirations in young minds with respect to the study of politics. I thank our principal ma'am, Dr. Himlata Bagla, who is ever ready and ever encouraging for bringing novel approaches and methods of education. It's only because of her new educational vision that this webinar has become a reality. Thank you very much, ma'am. I also thank all the faculties who have joined here in this webinar right now. And thank you all the participants who have joined from all over for this important webinar. Now, without any delay, I will give this over to our principal ma'am for the introductory and welcome address. Our principal and the senior dean of Science and Technology at HSNC University, Dr. Himlata Bagla. Please, ma'am, please come in, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Vritant, and thank you, Disha Jain, for your kind words. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
ma'am. I wish each one of you a wonderful evening, and I extend a warm welcome to Professor Akash Singh Rathore and my colleagues from the department and of KC College, and all the participants who have joined this webinar. So Dr. Vritant, this is your first webinar in KC College. So all the very best for taking that initiative, and do continue this good job and inspiring our students and motivating them.
Thank you very much.
So friends, just because you do not take an interest in politics doesn't mean politics won't take an interest in you. This is what I read. It has been proclaimed by Pericles, one of the greatest statesmen of the ancient Greek civilization. But I believe if we determine the depth and magnitude of this statement, then we all surely realize that it is still as relevant as it had been in those archaic times. Today, a very important discussion in the form of this webinar, which revolves around the relevance of political theory today. So I'm very delighted for the fact theme, Professor Akash, in his intellectual acumen. And I came to know, I was reading his biodata, 8 books with several editions on various subjects, including politics, as Disha mentioned, history, legal thought. So I think I must say this, that Professor Rathore, your omnipresence is indeed incredible. So we are very fortunate to have you amidst us today. And who else would be better to encourage our youngsters in this subject? And let me tell you that this year, we have started this new university, HSNC University, and 3 prominent colleges of city of Mumbai have come together to form this university. And the main thought or the main mission, I would say, that we would want our students to adopt multidisciplinary approach and take interest in different subjects. They may take chemistry, physics, and they can continue their interest in political theory or political science. So I believe that such talks are very relevant today for our students. And indeed, our education system, if this opportunity is given to our students, will produce the real geniuses who are urgently needed for our 21st century human world. So I would say that everything is decided by politics. So why not each one of us or everybody masters the knowledge of it? So my dear students, my dear student friends who are watching this program from all over, and even friends across India, because I know there's live streaming happening in YouTube, and many more students will listen to this, or viewers will listen to this particular talk by Dr. Rathore. So I want to add that with the advent of this new world, which seems perhaps uncertain, political education will certainly play a crucial role always in making the right balance in our progress. So not only in governance and active politics, but also in innovation, technology, and medicine. I believe that the education of political theory will make our future leaders prepared and strong to be victorious in future. So I say this as an educationist and a representative of an institution. To each one of you, those who are listening, this particular who will be actually listening this talk of Dr. Rathore. And let me tell you that I assure you, I assure all my students all the support and encouragement for such multidisciplinary studies at KC College or at HSNC University. And for this, I also look forward to collaborate with intellectuals like Professor Akash in future, with whom we can build a solid foundation for the education of politics, and especially in our HSNC University. So much more we are looking forward to this today's session. And I'm very, very happy that Dr. Ritant has taken this initiative. And I know that each student who's listening this will get new insights and, and guidance from this particular talk. So my best wishes to one and all. And once again, I extend my warmest welcome to Professor Akash to this platform, digital platform of KC College. Thank you very much for making me part of this program. Thank you so much. And over to Dr. Ritant to take it forward.
Thank you. Excuse me. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me, ma'am? Yes. Sorry. There was some problem with my connection. So thank you very much, ma'am, for this encouraging talk. We really want to hear from you more and more, ma'am. So now let us not delay, and I'll give this to one of our students, Disha, who wants to speak a student's representation just before our guests talk. So I hope Professor Akash would allow us to let Disha come in. Professor Akash?
Sure. Of course.
Yeah. So Disha, can you please come in and make your statement here?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Yeah, thank you, Disha. Thank you.
Good evening, sir, ma'am, and all the participants here. I am very glad that I got the opportunity to say my words in this webinar. I have always imagined that learning political theory is only the task of politicians, but since I have started learning the subject, I came to know that we all share the same resources, jobs, and rewards, and we need human rights and rules for our development. Thus, political theory is not only important to politicians, it is important for everybody. The process of organizing state and society therefore becomes important to maximize harmony and prosperity. Political theory becomes important to facilitate the unity and integrity of all the collective needs of the society as it tries to study and find solutions to problems in this process. The relevance lies in evolving various approaches regarding nature and purpose of the state. Apart from this, political theory also seeks to establish the moral criteria for judging the ethical work of political theory. The more I'm learning political theory, the most important thing I have learned is that our common sense and human natures are heavily influenced by the views of the thinkers who are the political theorists. As we study political theory in depth, we understand that everything is related to politics. So I am able to see how indispensable is the study of political theory. To know more about it, we are honored to have the great philosopher Sir Akash Singh Rathore, who is also the author of many well-written books, to talk on this topic with us. Sir, we are very dedicated to know more and would consider ourselves very lucky to hear the information from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Disha. Now, now we'd like to hear from our guest speaker, Professor Akash Singh Rathod. So I welcome Professor Akash Singh Rathod to please come on and speak and enlighten us on this subject, very important subject of the relevance of political theory today. Please, sir.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ritan. Nice to see you again.
Yeah.
We met more than 1 year back, I think it was. I've lost track of time with the lockdown. I have not. Thank you, Principal Bagla, and making this first webinar possible. If I had known it was your very first, I would have worn a proper shirt instead of looking like a philosopher. Apologize for that. Congratulations on the new university, and it's quite exciting to hear that you have a multidisciplinary orientation. I myself studied physics in undergraduate, and then of course political science, philosophy, and all, across the disciplines through each of my degrees. I understand that when we lock ourselves in one discipline, we have only a sort of corner view, like out of the corner of the eye, a view of reality, view of the world, and you need a multidisciplinary background to get a more complete perspective. So I'm very happy to hear that that's what your university is working for. And the two Dishas who spoke, thank you very much for your nice introductions. So I'm going to, one thing has been said 2 times, in fact, by both of the Dishas, that political theory seems to be the domain of politicians. So I want to maybe gently correct this this understanding, because it has something to do with the nature of political theory, to see that political practice, so what politicians are engaged in, what administrators, bureaucrats, even police, judges, all government officers are engaged in, is in fact quite different from what political theorists are engaged in. Now, the whole point that I want to communicate to you today is how essential it is. However, the reality is, unfortunately, that they remain often very distinct. And I hope to explain to you why keeping these 2 things distinct, that is political practice and political theory, is a great danger for all citizens. And in showing this, we'll understand in a new way what the relevance of political theory is today. I'll start with, just to convince you, since it was mentioned twice, an anecdote. I work occasionally as an advisor to political parties, and even to certain members of parliament. And I don't want to name the person who said this, because it's would be a little bit embarrassing for him, I think. But there's a long-serving member of parliament. I believe he has served 5, 10, 15 years. And as members of parliament increase in seniority, they're placed on more and more subcommittees. So Parliament, of course, can't decide every legal question, every law, every bill, with every member discussing and deliberating. So they break up into small committees, and a certain committee will then review a bill that's relevant to that committee, and then if it passes, it presents it to the open assembly for consideration and so on. So a certain very prominent member of Parliament was appointed to the Legal Reforms Committee. And this is a fairly significant committee in Parliament because we have a number of problems in India with the dated nature of our legal system, with the inconsistency between certain aspects of our code, like criminal code, and so criminal and civil law have certain overlaps and inconsistencies, and legal reform is quite significant. On the first day of the meeting of the Legal Reform Committee, I received a phone call from this member of Parliament who had good news, which was placed in charge of legal reform, and then he said the bad news is that he has no idea what it is or what it means. And he said, "You've written a book on legal theory, so I'd like to ask you, what is the law and why do we need to reform it?" Now, that is a serving member of Parliament for 15 years in charge of an extremely significant committee. Now, I'm not simply making fun of him. I do find it funny, but sometimes, as you might have learned, we academicians can be a bit snobbish. But I'm not just making fun of him. What I want to show is that the practice of politics, real active politics on the ground, is very, very distinct from the sort of reflection that goes into thinking about the nature of politics, or the nature of law, or the nature of political society, or even the nature of democracy. So we academicians, you probably have seen all of your teachers and professors, and you're less likely to see them wandering around from district to district, speaking with random people, riling them up, giving extempore speeches on various street corners and things like this. The politician or the administrator is engaged day to day, not with ideas, but with more or less brutal, stark, and pressing realities, the demands of everyday politics. And what ends up happening is that you have a political class, politicians, bureaucrats, administrators, even judges, certainly police, who haven't really read thoughts, significant thoughts, ideas, or more importantly, ideals and principles. What is democracy? Why is it important? And instead, we have people just working day to day, trying to do their jobs in a rather quotidian or mundane way. Now, as you probably know, during lockdown, there have been several occasions where police are more or less randomly beating people whom they find breaking curfew. And since the citizens' blowback against that police violence was fairly pointed, they began coming up with more interesting ideas, like making people do lunges or press-ups or things like this when they caught them. Now, the reason I raise this is a police person actually free to tell a citizen to do press-ups? Is a police person actually entitled to hit someone with a lathi or a stick if they find them violating a code? Now, only if we understood political theory, political ideals, political principles, would we actually know the scope of entitlement for a policeman or policewoman to take these kinds of autonomous authorities upon themselves. If you look at any police office, if you look at any streets or anything of the sort, there's too much going on for anyone to think and reflect upon the nature of power, the nature of state violence, and so on. So how is it that we have people who are in charge of politics who don't have the time to think about the nature of politics? And now to spread the ridicule back upon ourselves or myself, then there are people like me who sit and write books about the nature of politics, who have very little experience actually on the ground doing politics. So we have something of a gap between political practices and political theory. As I had mentioned when I began, one of the most important things about political theory is that it needs to fill into this gap. And why do I say that? So let's think about a few things that bother most of us today. Now more than ever, I think we're each observing the detrimental or negative effects of hierarchy in our social order, whether that is through patriarchy or paternalism, the lack of gender equality, the lack of class equality, the way that, as you might know, during the lockdown, the vast majority of us have been suffering financially because the economy has slowed down. And yet the richest people in India, as well as almost all countries internationally, have been making even more money during the lockdown than they normally make. So this is indicative of the way that wealth is moving in an imbalanced manner upwards, creating more class divisions. We have caste divisions, class, gender, all sorts of hierarchies. The question that someone can ask is, so what? What's wrong with it? What's wrong with these hierarchies? What's wrong with the exclusion of women from the workplace or of socially excluded continuing to be marginalized? Is because we as a people value equality. Now, equality is an abstract concept. It is, in fact, a concept that only arises because of political theory. Without the theoretical vantage point, equality is, in everyday practice, left out of the way that we behave in our social environment, and it's certainly left out of the way that administrators or police or judiciary or anyone else who's engaged in the very, very busy, fast-paced task of actual politics. An abstract concept like equality is not what's in anyone's mind when they're deciding who passes and who's left behind, who gets to enter and who doesn't. So this concept of equality shows us when in our social and civil milieu or environment, we're beset with all kinds of discriminations, all sorts of imbalances and injustices, it's only because of political theory that we understand why these are wrong and why they need to be remedied. I've been talking about policing. You can also think about the very rapid rise of what's referred to as a security state, where, for example, we're each under surveillance. Our data is continuously tracked, both at the national level by our own authorities within India, and then internationally by other state actors and private actors who wish to collect our data, either for business purposes, to target ads and understand our purchasing preferences, or for espionage and so on. So the total surveillance we find ourselves in under the as one aspect of the security state, and of course other aspects of the security state being the decline, for example, of habeas corpus. That means where when someone is arrested, that they should be that they should appear in a court within a reasonable amount of time to understand the charges against them. This has more or less been suspended, not only informally as a standard practice, but also formally under certain legislative new legislative inventions since 2001, including the National Security Act and so on, which means that people can be arrested and detained for an indefinite period of time without even being charged. Now, why am I mentioning these things? I'm sure you don't want to be picked up and detained without understanding why it is that you are picked up and detained. You don't want anyone you know, your family, your loved ones, you don't want this to happen to them. And yet it does happen, and it happens on a daily basis. And it happens more and more each day. And what's wrong with it? What's wrong with it is that we value liberty. Just like equality, liberty is a concept that's that has its home in political thought, political theory, political reflection. And while, let's say, CBI or whatever police are engaged with matters of so-called national security, it's not really the thoughts, abstract thoughts about liberty that are on their mind when they're thinking about how to nab someone, whether to break the door down, whether to plant evidence on their computers, whether to engage in all kinds of mischief that we know about, or even if it's not mischief, just the standard practices of policing. So liberty is the thing that those of us who reflect upon prioritize, whereas security is the thing that those who are in actual practice are prioritizing. And of course, when we ask, why have these measures been taken to reduce my liberty? The answer that we get from the state is always for your security. And just the same, you might be inferring that the way that I speak about unjust behavior by state authorities or judiciary or police or whatever might make me sound like some sort of left-wing radical. And this might be something that you are incapable of accepting or tolerating. Or I might find someone, let's say, who's supposedly much more rightward leaning, let's say, champion of Hindutva or something like this, And I might find their thoughts, their ideas, what they have to say, completely unbearable. We find ourselves, in short, in an extremely polarized social environment. And this polarizing meaning, in this case, left and versus right, this polarization is exaggerated, compounded by the way that we live modern lives. So as you probably know, things like Google searches are tailored based on your search history. The responses that you receive are algorithmically tailored to the sort of responses that the computer learning system, machine learning, thinks that you would like to have. Just the same if you're on social media, Twitter or other social media, Facebook. The way the algorithms work is that bubbles get formed. So if you write in or you upload information that can be perceived as leftward leaning, then what is presented to you on your homepage, there I don't remember the number, 2 billion or 3 billion people on Facebook and Twitter. And somehow you keep receiving the suggestions from the same sorts of accounts. And how is that? Because bubbles are created where the algorithms return to it. So whether it is the sorts of computers we're interfacing with, the media that we're using to reach to the outside world, even if we think that through the internet we can reach all the way across this the World Wide Web, in fact, the algorithms of every program is constructed to just return to us the sort of information that the machine thinks is more suitable to us. And what ends up happening is, on a daily basis, we consume the news that we prefer, and we don't consume the news that bothers us. So if you take me for a left-leaning, radical sort of ideologue, well, so will Twitter. And these are the kinds of tweets that will receive. Facebook provide me this sort of direction. And my news to newspapers, my news feed will suppress the sorts of news that I don't want to hear, that doesn't conform to my ideology. And it will promote the sorts of news that does conform to my ideology. In the good old days of print newspaper, you had to suffer to read or see headlines you find unattractive, unappealing, ideologically opposed to your ideas. But when it comes to online, the world becomes tailored to your ideology. Now, what's happening as a consequence of this is this polarization just increases more and more and more, so much so that we have lost, or we are losing, the capacity to even interact with people across our ideological divide, because we no longer have access to people across the ideological divide other than through violent encounters. So what we find is that I had mentioned the sorts of hierarchies we're opposed to. If you're a woman, a female, obviously you want to be treated equally as a male in whatever opportunities are available to you. And why we value that is because of the theoretical idea, the concept of equality, why we don't want people to be thrown into jail without good cause, because the principle, the idea of liberty. And what we have to reinvigorate in order to get over the polarization, which has reached epidemic proportion at this point, is of course fraternity. So fraternity is a concept, once again, that has its home, its proper origins in political theory, much more than political practice. So what is the practice? Well, I think you might have seen on the news that some people will be protesting, and then counter-protesters will come out, and then there will be violence or things thrown at each other, or not, or shootings or anything of the sort, looting, arson. Or you'll see on the news when the speakers come on those little squares, you know, and they're just all yelling at each other because they're from opposite ideological positions, or the anchor will be screaming at his or her guest because they're from opposing ideological positions, or members of parliament will storm the well and throw chairs and scream and fight, so on. Now, some of that is just theatrics and drama, but as a person who's taught at JNU for many years, I can also tell you that a lot of it is very, very real, violent, and the bloodshed and the misery that arises from it is, you know, it really happens. It's not just on the television. So without fraternity, we cannot transcend our own personal ideology and understand what our fellow citizens, whether they be of opposing ideologies or not. And of course, as friends, we always choose those who are most like us. So when is it that we get the chance to hear the so-called other side? Less and less frequently. And without fraternity, the only way we will encounter these people from the so-called other side is violently. And the history of the last 15 years has borne that out in you know, with great tragedy and precision. So these ideas or ideals or principles like liberty, equality, fraternity, I mentioned that they have their proper home in political theory, political thought, but I suppose you also know that they have their most proximate home in the preamble to the Constitution of India. So the preamble of the Constitution guarantees liberty, guarantees equality, and it aims to achieve this through fraternity, and the kind of fraternity that is that aims to assure the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation. Now, these sorts of ideas got written into the preamble and became the basic structure or the basic law in India as a consequence, not merely of the political practices that were going on during the nationalist movement or the freedom struggle, but also very much due to the orientation of the framers of the Constitution towards political theory and political thought. In fact, I had just mentioned the fraternity clause, fraternity so as to assure the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation. That's the original formulation from the 1950 formulation. Obviously, with the 42nd Amendment to the Constitution, integrity was added, unity and integrity of the nation. But I'm just mentioning the way that the framers had originally written it. So this fraternity so as to ensure the dignity of the individual and the unity of the nation came up for a great deal of debate in the Constituent Assembly. And many people, I believe there were 30 motions made to reverse the order and to claim that the preamble to the Constitution of India should guarantee liberty, equality, and fraternity so as to assure the unity of the nation and the dignity of the individual. Now, all the same concepts are there, but in the we have today, dignity of the individual. In other words, individual comes first, and dignity of the nation comes second. Now, if there were so many demands that the drafting committee who were writing the preamble should reverse it to unity of the nation and dignity of the individual, why is it that the drafting committee's version prevailed? Way of understanding the way that political thought, political theory enters into the very bedrock or framework of Indian civil and political society. Well, there were three people who were working on this clause. One was, of course, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who more or less authored the preamble. It was primarily his vision, but there were also others like K.M. Munshi and B.N. Rao's drafting committee. So we had each of these three people, Ambedkar, B.N. Rao, and Munshi, and they belonged to rather different ideological perspectives. Ambedkar wasn't a congressperson, as I assume you know. He was far more radical in orientation than the typical nationalist Congress member, like K.M. Munshi. And Munshi and Ambedkar didn't agree on too much, but here they came together and they agreed very strongly that dignity of the individual needs to come prior to unity of the nation. And then B.N. Rao, he was actually a bureaucrat, administrative officer, as well as an accomplished legal mind. And he joined on board. And what you find in the debate within the drafting committee itself was that Munshi and Ambedkar, and here I'm getting to the point, began discussing two German philosophers, one Immanuel Kant and the other Georg Hegel, so Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, as we say, GWF Hegel. So Kant and Hegel were both from the German intellectual tradition. Kant came prior, and Kant, as you may have learned in maybe philosophy or in ethics or a political science course, Kant had launched this idea of the fundamental or categorical value of the individual human person. And Hegel, on the other hand, came a generation later, and Hegel's position was more that the state, the unity or the organic nature of the state is more important, is prior to the fundamental unit of the individual, as Kant had proposed. So interestingly, these two very obscure German political philosophers are being debated by Munshi, Ambedkar, and Rao in the drafting committee so that they can come to agreement about how to tell the Constituent Assembly as a whole that they will not put the unity of the nation clause prior to the dignity of the individual clause. And through this discussion, Ambedkar, Rao, and Munshi came to agree that they have to stand fast and ensure that the dignity of the individual takes the pole position in the preamble to the Constitution. And the argument that B.N. Rao gave to the Assembly was to repeat the words of Dr. Ambedkar: until we achieve the dignity of every individual, we will never have unity in this nation. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning these things is because you see a very, very unique, direct correlation between classical political philosophers who discuss the nature of the individual and the state on the minds of the lawyers and politicians who drafted the preamble and then argued in the open Constituent Assembly and finds its way into the Indian Constitution as its fundamental guiding principles: liberty, equality, and fraternity, and the sort of fraternity that guarantees individual dignity so as to ensure our nation can have unity. And what you can see from this little historical digression that I went into to explain those concepts like equality, liberty, and fraternity, what you can see from this digression is that the way that we think about our social world, the way that you think about your freedom, the way that you think about your options, irrespective of your gender or of your caste or of your class, all of the ways that you value your liberties and your freedom and your equality and so on, ultimately derives from debates within political theory and political philosophy historically. That means that the very way that you think about yourself in your own privacy, when you're alone, is not necessarily generated just by your own particular background, but it's generated out of hundreds of years of debates that have been undertaken by political philosophers and political theorists. And that's quite fascinating to understand, especially in relation to what your principal had said, that you may not think about politics, but that doesn't mean that politics doesn't think about you. The interesting thing that this adds a layer onto is that the history of political theory thinks through you. Now, with that said, we can keep in mind that political practice and political theory often in the everyday have a cleavage or a separation, with political theorists, academicians such as myself, spending too much time in books, and political practitioners spending too little time. But as we see, the only way that the certain guiding values of something like our Constitution become realized is when practitioners embrace theory and thought. And of course, the only way that something like a university or academic space can fulfill its role in a democracy is when theorists or thinkers, academics and intellectuals, of course, assume these fundamental political values like liberty, equality, and fraternity in order to practice their pedagogy. So it makes no sense in our modern world if I, as a professor, should favor my male students over female students because I'm, practice patriarchy and believe that only men deserve education, or if I were to prioritize or preference people of certain castes or religions or anything of the sort. So we in the abstract academic world are in no way free of the principles that our own discipline or disciplines brought into consciousness, into historical emergence, which then practitioners took up and put into documents like the Constitution. Everyone, in short, is invested in the interrelationship of political theory and political practice. So, before I move on to just the last part about what type of theory, if we understand the relevance of political theory, it's where our ideas, our ideals, our principles come from. I'm going to discuss what type of theory, but before I do so, I'm just going to give you one last instance of the way that theory, the history of political theory, thinks through you. Members of parliament, as I had mentioned, don't on a daily basis during a parliament session ask themselves, what is democracy? They just assume that India is a democracy and that has certain, procedural and formal significance, but they never contemplate what is democracy, because parliament is not a place for contemplation. Of course, it's a place for deliberation and lawmaking, and more the academia or the university is the place for contemplation. And yet, if we are to understand the significance of the laws that are created by parliament, we have to ask ourselves certain basic questions, like, what is my obligation to the state? So let's assume that the parliament passes a law about any of these issues, equality or liberty. Let's take equality, and we find that due to large-scale social inequalities suffered by marginalized persons, some efforts must be taken in order to advance the interests of the marginalized. And we refer to this as affirmative action, and it can take formal effect like reservation. Now let's assume that I myself don't belong to any socially marginalized group. What obligation do I have to follow this law, to implement this law? Now, as I assume you know, we have a number of very, very beautiful and important laws on affirmative action reservation, and we have very, very little good faith implementation of these laws. This is just more evidence of the need to do something about social inequality and marginalization. The people of communities, this puts me at a disadvantage. I'm not a casteist, or I'm not. I don't discriminate against women or differently abled people and so on. So why am I being penalized when in my personal practice, I don't do anything of the sort? Well, just the same can be said about any law that you don't agree with. So what is it about democracy that makes laws that we don't agree with still fundamentally binding on us? This isn't this kind of question can only be through political theory, and law political theory has been, as Disha had mentioned in the beginning, has been focused on understanding the nature of state authority and power and citizens' obligations to that authority and power. Very easily say that it's just a random chance that I was born in India or wherever, and why should I be under control of the Indian state? Now, imagine you ask a policeman this question. It's very unlikely you will get out of that conversation unbruised. This is not the sort of thing a policeman thinks about. So I want you to see that each of the decisions that you make, decisions you take, the way you think about things, has a legacy, a history of political theory, political thought behind it. And the values that you have, the principles that you have, were not generated by you yourself. They were generated in part by this genealogy, and you're in some way an agent performing that long history of political theory. But the interesting thing that we do is that make accept ourselves and decide sometimes that if something doesn't fall in my favor, I shall not follow it. And yet, when the things fall in when we rely on other people to do things that fall in our favor, we somehow expect them to do it, and we claim it's unfair or unjust if they don't. But of course, what goes for them goes for us as well. And the nature of democratic law requires that if it has been procedurally enacted according to the principles of the Constitution, democratic constitutionalism, whether we like it or not, we have to obey, or we are obligated to these laws, these norms, and these regimes. All right. I'm going to close with just a little bit about a problem or sort of puzzle that many political theorists in India find themselves faced with. And while I haven't probably convinced all of you to study political theory, even though that's something of the goal that I have, not because of my preference for that political theory as a discipline, but more because I've been trying to show you that political theory, that the history of political theory in some way puppeteers the way that you think and act. And if you want to have self-understanding, if you want to know why you have the values that you have, why you have the principles, ideas, and ideals that you have, then you can only discover these the answers to these kinds of questions by investigating what political philosophers and political theorists have been discussing, debating, and the ideas that they've come to that have been taken up into modern social life, as well as, of course, the modern legal systems and the Constitution. When people say words like liberty, equality, and fraternity, obviously the French Revolution, that's an 18th century event that occurred in France and the French colony, comes to mind, not the preamble to the Indian Constitution. So there's a very common, but I think erroneous assumption that ideas like liberty, equality, and fraternity are so-called Western concepts. Now, we hear about these ideas through the French Revolution, through the American Revolution. Disha had mentioned human rights. We hear about these basic rights of man and of the citizen. Of course, we shouldn't use that gender-specific terminology now. Human rights we use instead. And the declarations in the 18th century that, once again, all men, let's say all humans, are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights like liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So these ideas we associate with these 18th century so-called Western developments. But I want to just mention something to you, once again, a little bit about the distinction between theory and practice, political theory, political practice. When the 18th century declarations were made, in fact, when the specific rights of man was articulated in France at the end of the 18th century, a particular French colony, Haiti, heard this declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen, which begins that all men are free and equal in rights. And the Haitians, who were a slave colony making sugarcane for France, they said, "Oh, there's been a revolution in France. They have stated that all men are free and equal in rights. So obviously we're free. We're no longer slaves. We're no longer forced to work without pay for the French people. And we must no longer be a colony. We must be liberated. We must be our own nation or our own state." Well, what do you think France did? As soon as they understood that the Haitians believed, Black men and women, believed that the Declaration of the Rights of Man applied to Black men and women as well as to white French men, they sent naval ships to go and crush the Haitian Revolution. And Haiti, as you probably know, is in the Caribbean, not too far away from the United States, the Americas. And the United States, as I had just mentioned, had recently just declared, I believe 1787, again, end of the 18th century, that we are endowed by the Creator, God, in their, they're referring to God, with inalienable rights like life and liberty, freedom. So one would think that the Americans would have come to when the French are merely claiming that everyone is free and equal, and yet sending ships to suppress Black Haitian men and women who are saying that you said everyone is equal, so let's be equal. And the United States did nations at first. Instead, they themselves decided, yes, the French have a good idea here, and they sent their own army and navy to Haiti as well to help the French suppress and re-enslave the Haitians. Obviously, the United States had Black slaves at that time, and they didn't want their own slaves to learn from the Haitians that when they declared people are free, it meant Black men and women. Now, why am I going back to this 18th century? Because the point is that just because words are stated doesn't mean that that's the actual practice. And when empty words are stated, like liberty, equality, and fraternity, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or freedom and equality and rights, and so on, when empty words are stated from the theoretical or abstract side, it's up to practitioners, people on the ground, to make those empty concepts real, to realize those concepts on the ground in person. When a state declares that we are democracy, press dissent, they jail people who are protesting, then those concepts are really empty. And it is a requirement of practitioners, people on the ground, to fill those abstract, empty concepts with the reality. Now, ideas like liberty, equality, and fraternity that we have as the preamble to the Indian Constitution were largely empty concepts when they were declared by France and America and other countries of the so-called West in the 18th century, 19th century, because while these were declared, they were restricted to more or less property, upper class, white, Christian men and our population. So these ideas applied to a couple percent of the world, and 98% got to live in no liberty, no equality, and so on. Now, how did these ideas like liberty, equality, fraternity get realized then? Why are they our values and principles today? Precisely because of what we refer to as the global South or the colonized countries. Precisely because of freedom struggles like those of India, those of Haiti, and other countries. In other words, it is not the so-called Western countries that invented the concepts of liberty and equality and fraternity as we understand them as real things today. It is, in fact, all of the colonies, the global South, the so-called Eastern countries, or what you will, developing world and third world, and there are all sorts of terms for this. They are the ones that created liberty, equality, and fraternity as we know them today. Because when we have a thought, what does freedom mean? It is not the 18th century idea of freedom declared by a Frenchman. It is the idea of freedom articulated by people like Ambedkar, or, if you will, Gandhi, or Nehru, or others. So that these concepts are Western concepts, because concepts don't work like that. Concepts have to be realized in practice, and these concepts were realized only through the struggle and toil of countries like India in making them real and historic, and then once embodied, articulating them in things like the Preamble. So when we talk about political thought or political theory, we have to keep in mind both the way that political practice and political theory are separated, and the way that for our values and principles to be real and practiced, they have to merge and come together. And each one of us as individuals, you and I, are experiments in this unity of practice and thought, because as I had already told you, you yourself are in some way merely an agent of hundreds, if not thousands of years of the debates and discoveries of political philosophers and political theorists. But you are also a political agent. Every decision you make, whether to be fair, whether to be just, whether to be kind, fraternity, whether to give people their freedom and liberty, whether to recognize their equality, shows that you, although you are in some way just an agent of these past ideas of political thought, you are very much a practitioner, bringing into reality the fundamental values of the preamble of our Constitution. So the relevance of political theory today, if I can close now, is in fact, ironically, entirely within you. Because the ideas are dependent upon the choices, decisions that you make. And to get a full sense of yourself and your society, you need to study in some respects. What do these thoughts mean? Where do they come from? And how do I fit into them? Why is equality important to me, necessary to me? And why should I practice fraternity and ensure that I give others the equality that is due to all? And with that, I will close the part where I just engage with you and these questions. So I'll have a look at the chat and so on. Thanks for your patience and for being here today.
Thank you, sir.
Dhrutant, you can, yeah,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
I'll just have a look at these questions.
Yes,
so
yes,
may I read them
thank
for
you
you?
very much, sir. Sakshi, could you please wait for a bit? I would like
as you like.
Yeah. So, sir, can we have these questions read by Sakshi, because she is willing to read these questions so that it becomes easy in the process to take the questions? Yeah, of course. So, Sakshi, could you please read out the questions?
That's perfect.
Sure, sir.
Yeah. So let's go ahead. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
So the first question in the chat box is: Do you think it's not important for the political class, that is the politicians and administrators, need to know and learn the ideals of the nature of politics? Should I repeat the question?
Yes, I think I answered that one. I think I answered that one already by mentioning the member of parliament who was very successful in getting himself elected and yet had no idea what the law was for and what the meaning of democracy is. So it is crucially important that practitioners should be exposed to the history of political thought and the reasons why the law that they make is universally binding. As far as there are some, you can think of Shashi Tharoor, for example. He's a lawmaker who is himself a political theorist, and there are many others, but there certainly aren't several hundred others, which is how many members of parliament that we have, and it is of crucial importance. I think I had made that clear.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Excuse me, Sakshi.
Yes,
Sir,
sir.
I want to ask you once again, would you prefer reading out questions by yourself, or should Sakshi read out this? What do you think?
Oh, it's okay. We can continue like this.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Please go ahead, Sakshi.
Yes, sir. Is political theory really important for the progress of a nation? If yes, then how?
For the progress of an agent or nation?
Is political theory really important for the progress of a nation? And if yes, then how?
Nation.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I think I also answered this one. So
Yes.
let's look at the preamble to the Constitution of India. It doesn't have to be the preamble. It's on my mind because I recently wrote a book about it. But you can look at the Articles 14, 15, 16, 17, or Article 21, which has become crucial in questions of privacy, in questions of I'm sorry, I've just blanked on the word, but you understand that recently same-sex relationships have been decriminalized, and thanks to the Naz Foundation decision of the High Court, and then finally upheld in the Navtej Singh Johar decision. So Article 21 of the Constitution was crucial in determining that we have the right to cultivate our personalities. So we don't have to stick to the preamble to see that that the idea of developing human personality, or of fundamental equalities guaranteed through Articles 14, 15, 16, 17, and so on, are the legacy of political theory. And I don't know about you, I assume it's true for you. I would not want to live in a nation that did not recognize fundamental human dignity and equality. And there are many such nations. In Saudi Arabia, a woman can't drive unless accompanied by a man. And this is a clear violation of equality. And that would not, I would find it very difficult to live there without agitating against these kinds of violations of equality. So without the history of political thought and the principles and values it has given, the nation would be a very miserable place.
Yes, sir. Agreed. Thank you, sir. So the next question is political equality meaningfully achievable as a political goal? I repeat, is political equality meaningfully achievable as a political goal?
So let me I'm trying to be a little less serious. I feel I dragged you through a very serious lecture. One side of me that you probably don't know about is that I'm an endurance athlete, long distance runner, and swimmer and cyclist, triathlete. This morning, I took my last, I had mentioned that I'm moving from Delhi tonight. This morning, I took my last run in Nehru Park in Delhi. And I was feeling very nostalgic, but I was also feeling very lazy. And I really was too lazy to want to run this morning, but I knew that for the rest of my life, I would regret that I have this beautiful park in Delhi, Nehru Park, and that instead of using it when I could, I just gave in to my laziness. Now, is running every day actually a possibility for me? No, it's not. And yet, ought I struggle to run every day? Yes, I must. And so just because a concept is not necessarily fully achievable does not make it something that we must not strive for to the best of our ability and on a daily basis. I know I will never, I mean, I ran very slowly today because I was lazy. I'm working on finishing a marathon in under 4 hours. And other people do it in 3 hours and 30 minutes. Someone just did it in less than 2 hours, as you may have seen on the news a few months back. I know I will never run an under 2 hour marathon, and yet every day I try to do it. So political equality is something that maybe we will never achieve, but that in no way means that it's not the goal that we must all have and that we must all struggle to achieve every day.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sakshi,
Moving to the yes, sir.
Yes. I would like to use my discretion as a moderator, and I would like to ask a question by a senior professor. Sushma ma'am, she's asking questions, sir. So I would like to put this forth first before other questions. So would you please allow me to ask this question, sir?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So Sushma ma'am is asking, is there a decline of political theory in 21st century? Because I think this question is important because we teachers, as the teachers of political theory at undergraduate level, so we think that we are facing this question a lot. And would you please enlighten on this question? What is your opinion about this question? Is there a decline in political theory in 21st century?
Well, if this question was asked by a political theorist, then there might be a different way of thinking about it. So the question just generally posed, there are a number of ways of addressing it. So so let's try one or two or three different angles on it. So first, is there a decline? I don't know if there's a decline in the quality of political theory that is being produced around the world. There's certainly an increasing specialization that has resulted from the concentration or consolidation of the sovereign nation state model around the world. So 50, 100 years ago, you couldn't assume that the entire surface of the earth would be covered by 211 or however many there are sovereign nation states. There have that then get consolidated in their sovereignty vis-a-vis the rest of the world, so other states recognize them, and that internally become sort of move from weak to strong states. So 50 years ago, 100 years ago, there's no reason that we would believe such a thing. And because of that, it gave scope for the widest possible imagination about how the world should or could be governed, whether through communist utopias or socialist welfare or anarchic syndical of people. All of these things were options. But as you know, in the year 2020, the real debate is it going to be regionalism or isolationism? And that's very, very boring. And so if political theorists have started just to focus and specialize in narrower areas, it's because of the consolidation of one basic idea around the world, which is that the world is just going to be a system of 210 or whatever sovereign nation states. Now, personally, I'm just waiting for this to end because I don't like sovereign nation states. The whole idea to me seems idiotic, and I'm much more inclined to an anarchic syndicalism, but like the kind Noam Chomsky talks about, for example. So there are people like me. I can't believe I just compare myself to Noam Chomsky in the same sentence. Please don't believe I have that kind of an ego. I'm just saying there are people like Noam Chomsky or others who still write political theory in a broader imagination, but for the most part, things are getting more and more narrow and technical. So in that sense, the professor could have been asking about the decline of political theory. Secondly, the French philosopher Michel Foucault began writing about this concept of governmentality in relation to the way that these sovereign nation states have started to increase their sovereignty through strategies of governance. So how do you govern a population? Well, population becomes a key word because instead of governing citizens, you start governing populations, and you use all of the strategies of big data or of census or of various administrative tools to start not governing Akash and Dr. Vrutant and Sakshi and so on, but you start governing the greater metropolitan Mumbai, something of this administrative unit. And you use various tools and apparatus of the state to not through democratic processes legitimize the state through appealing to shared interests of citizenry, but you just flatly impose the reality, which is that there are masses of people and there's an administration, and this administration is in charge of this masses of people, and it will use these devices and techniques to govern or administer your life. And this process of moving from sort of democratic governance to governmentality has also been largely responsible for the way that common citizens, you and me, stopped thinking about all of the imaginative possibilities of political theory, because at the end of the day, the policeman is going to tell me to do push-ups, and I'm going to say how many. I'm not going to say, what right do you have to do this? Don't you understand that that Thomas Hobbes had said that the only reason we enter into the state is because it promotes my liberty, and now you're exercising the arbitrary control. How would you answer Thomas Hobbes for this act of yours? These things don't happen. And so because of governmentality and the way that we citizens have become more and more used to just doing whatever we're instructed to do by the state, because we can't imagine anything other than the state, that's another reason political theory has lost its purchase amongst people, students, professors, and so on. And then the third, so I first took the point of view of a professor talking about scholarship, research, political theory. Then secondly, about a professor's view about students, maybe why students aren't interested because of the way the world has changed with governmentality and so on. And now third, I'll take the position of the student. Political theory is not taught very well. So present company accepted, of course, you know that. For the most part, I studied political theory. I just could not stay awake in the classes. And yet, I realized everything exciting in life happens in this domain. So how is it such a mismatch that my professor of political philosophy, political theory is putting me to sleep in class. And yet when I go out, all I want to do is engage in politics and debate and things like that. So academicians have a great deal of responsibility to admit that our syllabus has not been properly framed, and our pedagogy is not very inspired or inspirational. And if we can't just talk about social contract and Hobbes and Locke and Mill and all of those things, because who cares about these people? No one today cares about these people. So you have to move through the present concerns and then go and reach back the ideas that illuminate the present, as opposed to just dragging people through from the beginning and say Locke said this and Mill said this, and I'm asleep already just thinking about that. So the third reason I think that could answer that question is that we need to become much more creative professors of political theory in order to capture the imagination, because it is really the most most exciting discipline, and yet somehow our syllabus has managed to turn it into such a bore. I hope I didn't take too long. I just gave 3 points of view on things like that.
That's very true, Professor Akash. And thank you very much for bringing on these 3 aspects, because I think that this is a very, very important question, and the way you responded to this question particularly was really enlightening and invigorating. So yes, to proceed, I would like to ask you, Professor Akash, first, that how much time do we have now? What do you think that how many questions can we take now, and how much time we can take more to go on with the questions?
Well, I don't want to, if anyone asks a question, I would like to answer them. I'll try to give briefer responses so that we can complete it. But if, 10, 15 minutes, if we could wrap up, is that okay?
Yeah, it's absolutely fine. So I would please request Sakshi here.
Yes,
Sakshi,
sir.
could you please bring on few more questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So, sir,
Please,
one question has been repeated by many of the students, which is just a second. Yeah. So, how the increasing relevance of political theory will help to overcome the challenges in political arena in contemporary times? I repeat, how the increasing relevance of political theory will help to overcome the challenges in political arena in contemporary times, and how could the youth possibly help in this?
Yes. I'll begin with the latter part. How can the youth possibly help? It's not that the youth can help. It's the youth are the only ones who can do it. So it's not that the young are just going to contribute something to the older generations. This is the young's responsibility. This is everything depends upon the youth. Now, if we look at the way that demographics and ideas have changed over time, you can see that the ideas, the ideologies, the principles, the values of people under 25 are radically different from those of people over 45. And the problems that people over 45, such as myself, have introduced to the world are not going to be solved by the people who are over 45. You probably know Einstein had said that we can't solve problems using the same logic or thought processes that we used to create problems. Well, this can be extended. The same generations who created global warming and environmental degradation and systems of total repression and surveillance and patriarchy and casteism and inequalities and bankrupted our social assistance system. And we did all of those things. We're not about to fix them. So only the youth will fix all of these things that my generation has all the problems that my generation has created. Now, to the first part of the question, how is it relevant, or how can it be done? Well, one good thing, of course, my generation didn't do this either. Previous generations, like the generation of Ambedkar and many other great minds, had at least identified the fundamental guiding principles of human social cooperation, what we call eusociality. So there are many ways that society can interact: violently, zero-sum game, where if I increase, then someone else decreases. There are various ways of interaction, but eusociality is a situation where through our cooperation or even competition, everybody can improve together. Now, fortunately, the principles of eusociality have already been discovered, and I think you find them there in the preamble to the Constitution: justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, and dignity. Now, the question is, if theory has tossed up these concepts, and yet my generation, or the older 45s, have taken those concepts very lightly and not realized them, embodied them in action, obviously what the youth not only must do, but I'm very confident will do, is that they will take these empty concepts that my generation left behind, and they will fill them with real significance. And I see this already with my own daughters. I have two daughters, 11 and 14, and very few days pass without one of them pointing out that I am a hypocrite or that I don't do enough to live up to the principles, that I'm always talking about in the preamble, in the Constitution. They'll tell me that I'm using the wrong language, the way I speak is disrespectful, that I'm being hierarchical or authoritarian, and so on. They're very, very sensitive to the principles, which are essentially the constitutional principles, constitutional values. And they're much more invested in making them real rather than hearing an old man like me just talk about them. So I think, I'll stop there because I have to move a little faster to the questions.
Thank you, sir. So there are last two questions we'll take. So
yes.
The question is, so as we have political science as an optional subject, we should have it as a compulsory one. What do you think on this? I'll repeat. As we have political science as an optional subject, we should have it as a compulsory one. What do you think on this?
I think I'm opposed to compulsory anything. So I'll give you another example, which I find very, very illuminating, although I haven't fully understood it. So I mean, I know it's very important, but I haven't fully grasped it. Now, over the last year, I was writing this book on the preamble, called Ambedkar's Preamble, A Secret History of the Constitution of India. And my daughters had started at a new school here in Delhi. And the NCRT textbooks came for their school. I've forgotten the board, but CBSE board, or I think. And every textbook, it didn't matter the subject, physics, chemistry, biology, geography, geology. It had the preamble in the front of it. And now I was so enamored of the preamble that I spent a year writing a book on it. But when I saw the preamble in my daughter's geography textbook, it made me nauseous. I couldn't think of what sort of paternalistic government had the supposedly brilliant idea of forcing down the throat of a 10-year-old child in geography, the preamble. And I'm sorry if I sound like a curmudgeon or something like this, but if a document or a subject, a discipline is valuable, then you teach people how to think about what is valuable, and they will naturally go to the important subjects. Pedagogy, education is about freedom. Education is about awakening the soul, the spirit in the individual, and the talents that lie there, the possibilities that can be envisioned, and so on. It is not about saying you must do this and you must do that. And because we have concentrated so much on the compulsory and these very tightly constructed syllabus, disciplinarity, and so on, that we find ourselves having come to an impasse in our education system. And India's higher education system, I'm sorry to report to you, is overall a catastrophe. And thankfully, people have been realizing this, and universities like yours are opening up where they rectify these, you must study this and you must study that, and encourage something like multidisciplinarity. So instead of making it compulsory, in an academic setting, you get introduced vibrantly to all of the options. You wake up your spirit, your curiosity, your interest, and you will flow to what you have a talent for and what is objectively important. I said I was going to give short answers, but I feel very strongly about this. I don't think that any great figure in a discipline, whether it be from the sciences, physics, math, art, whatever, I don't think any great figure emerged because they were demanded to study it. And we need to follow more new models where our talents and so on are cultivated by the environment, rather than we're told that X, Y, and Z is important, so mug it up now and repeat it to me on your final paper.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Totally agreed. So the next question is, sir, I feel democracy is a constructive and a constant process where everyone has to contribute in order to achieve true democracy. How can we as youth contribute through actually joining political organizations? I repeat, I feel that democracy is a constructive and a constant process.
I got it.
Yeah. Okay, sir.
Unless you're repeating it for other people, but I got it. So once again, I'll tell you, I want you, and I think you're, now I know at least two of your faculty, your principal and your political science professor. I think what you will find is that they're not going to be telling you that maybe you can contribute something here or there. Everything is up to you. Everything is up to you. So it's not it's not that you are going to do some small thing to help us. We are trying to teach you what we know and what we have spent time learning and what's valuable, so that you can take over, so that everything will be up to you. And so you have not a small contribution to make. You are democracy. India is the youngest country in the world. We have more than 50% of the population is youth, and this is more than any other country. And yet we have the oldest politicians in the world. It's not uncommon for our prime minister to be 170, 180 years old. And if you look at several other countries, you'll see prime ministers or presidents in their 40s, whereas here you're considered. I could be mistaken, but I believe Rahul Gandhi was still considered part of Youth Congress when he was aged 40. When I turned 40, I already had trouble walking and sitting and things like this. So there's nothing youthful about being 40 years old. So you have to realize that the political domain, the social domain, the economic domain, the cultural domain, all of these things are yours at 20, at 21, at whatever. You don't have to wait till you have a bald spot if you're a man or whatever, to think that now you're entitled to participate in the public domain. The public domain is yours now. So I would encourage you to get involved everywhere in every way that you can, culturally, politically, socially, and so on, right now, or rather after your studies, after you've done enough studying, then you go do that. I can't pull you away from your classes and so on. So I hope, I keep giving you long answers about this because I feel very, very strongly about this. The future of this country and its success relies on you. It doesn't rely on some 70-year-old man telling us what to do on our balconies, or whatever you want to say. It's all you, and so take it seriously. You have everything that you need you're in a good academic setting. Use that as a foothold to emerge into political, social, cultural, economic, other settings, and live a complete life the way that the founding mothers and fathers of this country wanted for all Indians. Was that the last question?
Yes, sir, it was the last question.
Sakshi, I would like
because
to come
I
in.
had better get going. I still have to pack. And
Yes. Thank you very much, sir, for this session. I hope that we all learned a lot from this webinar. And before coming to the last section of our webinar, that is the vote of thanks, which will be given by Sakshi, I would like to think a minute loudly. And I would like to really thank our professors, our senior professor who are present here throughout the webinar. Thank you, Sakshi ma'am, for being here. And thank you, Sushma ma'am, for being here. Because your presence really made this webinar meaningful and purposeful. And also, I would like to really thank moreover to the lucid elaboration of political theory made by Professor Akash, because I think somewhere you thought, Professor, you were pondering over convincing students about getting more towards the political theory, towards learning the political theory and political thought and political science per se. So I hope that you have been successful in convincing them for learning political theory, because I think that their basic purpose, where they think about the relationship between the state and the individual, between the two individuals, and that is the complex issue which they generally face. And this issue has been resolved, I think, by this webinar, by your wonderful elaboration, the way you have put the political theory and the way you have put it along with the Indian political theory, by the way you have bring in the constitution and the constitutional ideals of India. So it was really a lucid elaboration which made us all understand the relevance of political theory today. So thank you very much for this talk, Professor Akash. I hope that we all will remember this very insightful talk. And I now give it back to Sakshi for the last vote of thanks. Thank you very much, all of you.
Yes.
Thank you.
It was indeed an enlightening discussion, sir. Now, while concluding today's webinar, on behalf of the Political Science Department, I would like to thank Professor Akash Singh Rathore for giving us his valuable time and deep insights into the topic. I would also like to thank KC College and our respected principal, ma'am, for giving us this opportunity, and also to our vice principals and faculties who joined in the webinar. I also thank to our Pol Science professor, Brutan sir, for organizing this insightful webinar. I would also like to thank all the participants for joining and being an active part of the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining.